Hello and welcome to The Day That Antitrust Died, a special feature of the Ipse Dixit podcast. I'm Brian L. Frye, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law.
And I'm Ramsi Woodcock, Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law as well. On March 2nd, 1974, a group of antitrust scholars met at the Airlie House in Warrenton, Virginia. Together, we are going to investigate whether that was the day that antitrust died. We're really fortunate to have here Daniel Crane, who's a professor at the University of Michigan School of Law and one of the foremost authorities on antitrust law in the United States, who has also written extensively about historical issues in antitrust law. So we're super lucky to have him here today to help us answer the question whether in 1974 antitrust died or not. So the significance of the Airlie House conference is, I think, not subject to huge debate. I think it's viewed as having been a tremendous intellectual catastrophe for the dominant establishment approach to antitrust in the mid-20th century, which was relatively vigorous relative to the antitrust that we have today. And given now that folks are looking at antitrust and asking whether we shouldn't go back to the old, more vigorous approach, it's worthwhile asking exactly why that approach fell apart after the Airlie House conference. Now that conference has a wonderful conference volume. It's called Industrial Concentration and New Learning. And in it, there are these amazing dialogues between all of the participants, including figures who went on to be really important in the antitrust world, like Richard Posner and Mike Shearer, who we had on for an earlier podcast. And in these debates, you have the establishment folks like Mike Shearer, who seem completely overwhelmed by the vigor of these Chicago School arguments. And so the establishment people would subscribe to this framework in which you had to constantly beat down barriers to entry into markets that were being put up by firms. And the Chicago School people came out and said, hey, look, big firms might not be bad for consumers. They have more funds to invest in research and development. They can innovate. They can do things that smaller firms can't, and they can produce better products for consumers. And this argument really seems to have won out in Airlie House. And so I'm curious, first whether you agree with that sort of 100-mile up sort of view of what happened in Airlie House, and also whether you think that was a good change in antitrust, to sort of recognize that big isn't always bad and that competition isn't always the best thing for consumers.
Sure. So, I think Airlie House is obviously an important inflection point. Although if you really go back, the Chicago School project is announced as early as 1956 with Director and Levy's article sort of giving the agenda for the Chicago School to come, and work done by by lots of people associated both in the law school at Chicago and the economics department well earlier than that. So what really happens, of course, is that in 74, really to 77, 78, when the Supreme Court really takes up sort of almost full-throatedly the Chicago School project, is you get sort of this coming out of the Chicago School on the big public stage. And I think what's happening at one level is an intellectual battle between the structural school associated with Harvard and the rising Chicago School on sort of the empirical things that you're talking about. Questions about scale, questions about the inevitability that concentrated oligopolies will produce lower output levels and higher prices. So at that level, you're getting this very academic debate that's largely empirically focused. And after a while, I think Chicago arguably starts winning that game on the empirical side. Now, it doesn't mean that they're right forever. It just means that in terms of the particular dynamics of that moment, Chicago is winning that fight. But you also, I think, have sort of at a political level, a desire in the country to shift in some new directions. And when Bork sort of packages this all in terms of the consumer welfare standard, there are lots of reasons that would have a significant appeal in the 70s. This is, after all, the time when Ralph Nader is talking about the consumer and how we've sort of sold short the American consumer. And so from left to right.
Actually, if I can just cut you off, Mark Green, who was a Nader's raider, was present at the Airlie House conference in 1974.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's a way in which both at the sort of the intellectual and empirical level, there's a fight that's happening. I think Airlie House really sort of showcases that side of it. But there's also sort of in the wider economy, in the wider political system, a willingness to take antitrust and regulation both in a new direction. So by the end of the 70s, you have Democrats like like Steve Breyer and Teddy Kennedy talking about deregulating the airlines, and you sort of get lots of attacks on regulation itself as something that's standing in the way of the consumer and consumer welfare. And so again, I think it's important to understand this historically, both as the intellectual confrontation between structuralism and the Chicago School claims, but also sort of socially and politically as kind of a moment when there is a receptivity to a new story about antitrust and regulation being focused on the consumer.
There's something that's interesting about this is this connection between deregulation, which was going on at the same time that you had Airlie House, and sort of the ramping down of antitrust enforcement, is that regulation was often about sort of government control over very large companies, right? And I think principally of AT&T, which was actually broken up as part of an antitrust suit, but which had been sort of your archetypical regulated monopoly for 50 years before it was broken up in the early 80s as a result of this. So you had this sort of, the mid-20th century approach to size seemed to have been regulation. So you either regulated the large company if you thought it was good to have the large company, or if you thought it was bad to have the large company, you broke it up through antitrust. And then you have the Chicago School come in and say, wait a second, large companies might actually be good. We shouldn't be breaking them up with antitrust. You might have thought, looking at that mid-20th century history, that the next step would be to, well, if these companies should be big, let's regulate them,
right,
the way we've been doing. But instead, at the same time that we're celebrating size, we're also eliminating the structures that we had once thought were important to regulate size.
And remember, one of the Chicago School critiques of regulation is that it is a predatory process. This is the rise of public choice theory as well. Regulation itself is a predatory process that's captured by the dominant firms in the industry to create entry barriers and keep out small competitors, to the detriment of the consumer. So it's sort of intellectually and sort of politically, Chicago tells a story where the problem is not just antitrust, the problem is both regulation and antitrust, kind of in conspiracy together to harm the consumer. We read Bork's antitrust paradox. He is very clear that there are that the major sources of durable entry barriers is government regulation. When Bill Baxter comes from Stanford to work in the Reagan administration and sort of is the guy who breaks up AT&T, it's an extraordinary fact, right? We kind of forget. We talk about the Reagan administration killing antitrust. Well, the biggest breakup in American history was that AT&T breakup, and that was orchestrated by the Reagan Justice Department. And that's right out of Baxter's view that regulated monopolists like AT&T are predatory on regulatory processes to harm competition. So AT&T was rate regulated on basic phone service. They were not rate regulated in adjacent products like hardware, and so they could, according to Baxter, they could tie. They could basically use their power that they couldn't spend in the regulated sphere to coerce customers to buy other things from them. And this is all sort of part and parcel of a broader package of a monopolist ability to be predatory on the regulatory system itself. So one of the sort of the sweet spots for Chicago is telling a story about how if you're worried about monopoly, you don't necessarily need more antitrust. What you need is deregulation, since regulation itself is what's propping up the durable monopolies that we have.
Yeah, it's almost like the thread that ties together Chicago in the antitrust space and Chicago with respect to regulation is just this notion that wherever government is involved, that's bad. And yet, the paradox when you speak about the AT&T case is the arguments, some of the arguments that get made in the Airlie House conference about monopolies is they say, well, you have people like Harold Demsetz and John McGee saying, well, if we do end up with a monopoly, we don't have to do anything to break it up through antitrust because natural market forces will eventually cause other firms to enter the industry and break it up. And that goes all the way back to the Schumpeterian idea of creative destruction and so on.
Right.
But the only antitrust case that the Reagan administration pursues through to a conclusion and breakup is AT&T. Why was it necessary to break AT&T up when all you really would have needed to do was to deregulate AT&T according to the antitrust version of the Chicago theory, and just have market forces play themselves out? It's a peculiar thing, isn't it?
I do think that there was a obviously the AT&T case has been going on for a long time, and I think that the view was they were such an entrenched monopolist because of such a long history of predation on government processes and regulation that you need to sort of break that cord cleanly. But go to the Chicago School's definition of an entry barrier, right? Today we talk about entry barriers as things that keep out new entrants, but the Chicago School defined entry barrier very specifically as costs or difficulties to enter a market that are faced by new entrants, but not faced by the incumbents in the industry. And that was really significant because there are relatively few of those kinds of entry barriers, right?
Yeah.
The one big exception, or the one place you really found those in the Chicago definition, was where there was government regulation. Because oftentimes government regulation would grandfather in incumbents or give an advantage to incumbents as opposed to new entrants. And so, again, if you were sort of thinking through the Chicago theology on this, firms that were subject to pervasive regulation would actually have durable market power. But if you took that regulation away, then why would we fear even dominant firms? Now the Schumpeterian story comes in. Dominance is only as good as the technology is good, and it quickly erodes. Entry isn't so hard if there aren't things like government regulations propping it up. So I think that sort of helps explain why we get this sort of this simultaneous package of deregulation and let's take our foot off the antitrust pedal.
That does sound right. And so now we've got it's sort of a resurgence of populist antitrust, and there's sort of people out there saying, well, we need to go back to this mid-20th century approach, and I almost get the feeling that the argument is we should bring back also the sort of mid-20th century economics. We should start thinking about cases again in the sort of old structure, conduct, performance paradigm, and so on. And so one wonders, I mean, so the last 40 years have just sort of, did we learn nothing from them? Were they just all entirely a waste? Or is there a way to kind of, find a middle path in which, perhaps we have more antitrust enforcement, but we don't, we don't lose some of the lessons about the importance of size? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, what's interesting, of course, is that the political moment we live in today, which is the sort of this new Brandeisian or some people call hipster call for significantly reinvigorated antitrust enforcement, is not primarily coming out of sort of formal economics at all. I mean, it's coming out of sort of a movement largely sort of the progressive left that's very concerned about the state of concentration or power, particularly in big tech in the American economy today. But it's really more almost of a social criticism than an economic criticism. I hate to make that distinction because, of course, it's a criticism of economic structures and economic principles, but it's much more, I think, attuned to sort of Brandeisian themes, which really are sort of pre-structural. I mean, structuralism was not a kind of small is beautiful claim. It wasn't sort of, industrial liberty is key to democratic liberty. It's much more, it's a very specific empirical claim about a certain set of relationships between structures and conduct and performance of markets. And I think now, in some sense, the call is to go back to more of a moral and social theory about what antitrust is supposed to accomplish, which, that's the Robinson-Patman Act, right? The Robinson-Patman Act is not part of structuralism. It's 1936. It's really, good 15, 20 years before structuralism comes to the fore as a predominant economic theory, right? The Robinson-Patman Act is a theory about certain kinds of business relationships and the misuse of power and sort of why having big chain stores is a problem. So I'm not sure where this current moment is going to take us. I don't really see it, though, as a call to go back to the economic theories that undergirded structuralism so much as sort of the political and social theories that undergirded Brandeisianism.
So in a way, it's trying to go back even further than the 1950s.
The curse of bigness, right? This is Brandeis's work before he goes to the Supreme Court, right? This is really, I mean, this is really going back to the 1914, the FTC Act and the Clayton Act, and sort of the whole sweep between that, 1936, and the Robinson-Patman Act. And of course, what happens to sort of take the momentum out of that Brandeisian moment is the war. And during the Second World War, big business, is vital to the war effort. It's vital to our engagement and war mobilization. And so the Justice Department is tolling antitrust cases. Thurman Arnold is basically kicked out of the antitrust division and given a seat on the D.C. Circuit, which seems like a promotion to me, but he didn't see it that way. And so there's a view that during the war that we're going to go after, that we're not going to go after big business so much because it's crucial to the war effort. Coming out of that, then you kind of large scale is being legitimized, large scale business is legitimized, large scale government's legitimized, but people have experience with a huge government of the war effort. Big labor is still on the table. And so it's a different, it's not the curse of bigness so much anymore. It's more of a theory about over concentration of markets and sort of the idea of keeping corporate and business power within bounds, but we're still be comfortable with very large business scale organizations, right? And so what I hear now from the Neo-Brandeisians is to go in some sense back to some of those themes from the 20s and 30s about the sort of the moral and social dangers of a big scale across the board.
So we shouldn't. It's not that. So Shearer at Airlie House comes in with this huge study showing, where he talks to all these engineers and he figures out what the minimum efficient scale is for, major industrial firms. And it's, he says it's smaller than what it is now in 1974, but in fact, it's still pretty large. But the Neo-Brandeisians want to go back to way smaller than that. They want to go back to sort of, small business, they want the sort of 19th century small business type world or some form of that.
I mean, they want. As we look sort of at the lineage of ideas in American history, a lot for me goes back to Jefferson and Hamilton, right? And sort of their views on scale. Jefferson's view on scale in government and in business, right? Jefferson wants an agrarian economy, the economy of the household producer. Hamilton wants an industrial and banking economy, and he wants big government to support it, right? And when you look at that thematically, that carries forward to the 19th century, to the 20th century. I think Brandeis is really the heir of Jefferson in many ways. Brandeis is a sharp critic of big business, of course. He coins the idea of the curse of bigness. But Brandeis is also one of the people on the Supreme Court that's putting the brakes on FDR's expansion of federal government power. Brandeis thinks there's a threat in bigness, both in bigness in government and bigness in business, right? And I think part of what's interesting about the current crop of so-called neo-Brandeis people is that they're very skeptical of big business power. I'm not sure they're taking the Brandeisian views on the scale of the federal government. So Liz Warren is not a Brandeisian, right? She may be Brandeisian on antitrust, since she wants to break up big business. But I don't get any sense that she has the same kind of concerns about the expansion of federal governmental power as a Brandeis had.
That is an interesting contrast, right? So the progressives want small private institutions, but are more or less comfortable with large government institutions, and that there's sort of an inconsistency there, which sometimes makes me wonder, sort of whether there are particular interests that that neo-Brandeisians are interested in protecting, right? So, one thing that struck me is that a lot of neo-Brandeisianism seems to have come out of sort of opposition to Amazon's, sort of destruction of the publishing industry, and also sort of big tech, Google and Facebook's destruction of the newspaper industry, and neo-Brandeisianism has been largely a creature of sort of journalists, right, and writers. It's been huge in the press and not so much within the academic literature. And so it makes you wonder whether there's actually sort of a particular discrete interest group that's operating, sort of, sub rosa to some extent behind it, right? Which is, writers are threatened by big tech in multiple ways. They're threatened by Amazon because of what it's done to publishing, with ebooks and so on. They're threatened by, by Google and Facebook because of what they've done to journalism. And so, and big tech really has been the sort of, public enemy number one for neo-Brandeisianism, right? It's government, large government isn't such a problem, but these particular large private firms which are threatening writers and journalists are a problem. And so, so interestingly, one thing antitrust has always had an issue with is, becoming sort of a vehicle for a particular economic interest, whether it's small business or whether it's, writers or what have you, trying to sort of, find some kind of protection from market forces. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, would that be part of the equation?
I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but now that you say it, it seems to me plausible. So, I mean, listen to Barry Lynn talk about his vision for antitrust, and he often sort of talks about growing up in a town with sort of small mom and pop stores, and then you see Walmart come in and sort of the destruction of sort of small scale, and it's almost this sort of nostalgia for a way of life that seems to have passed us by in this sort of rush towards concentration. Whether it's a particular threat to his trade as a journalist or not, I haven't really thought about that. But I think you're right to say that antitrust has tended to always attract interest groups. So a few days ago, CNN had a headline that said something to the effect that well, actually, shockingly, even some capitalists are supporting Liz Warren's call for breakup. And my reaction was, capitalists have always supported aggressive antitrust. It just depends on which capitalists you're talking about, right? It's lots of. I mean, frankly, behind behind the idea of breaking up the FANG, let's say, Facebook, Apple, Google, Netflix, are lots of really, really big tech and media companies that would love nothing better than to see Google and Facebook and Amazon broken up, and big online retailers, right, or other retailers. So so while the leading edge of any antitrust movement will often be captured by a few faces and a few ideas and a kind of a school of thought, you're going to get support from that. Almost any action you want to take from people who stand to make money off of that outcome, right? And that doesn't mean that the movement's wrong. It's just to say that there's no such thing as a pure version of antitrust that's not that's not being ridden by people who have financial interest in its success.
Yeah, I was wondering if going back to the Airlie conference sort of framing for a second. To what extent do you think the transition to this new Chicago school perspective on antitrust analysis and enforcement was inevitable? Like it would have happened just as a natural intellectual progression of sort of the economic thought of the time? And to what extent, or rather to what extent do you think it was sort of sparked by some particular set of socio-political or kind of intellectual currents that were particular to that moment in time? And in particular, I'm kind of wondering about the sort of longevity and power of this kind of consumer welfare perspective, because one thing that struck me about the kind of hipster antitrust argument is the way that they try to shoehorn a lot of these, which I agree are much more kind of normative, moral, political perspectives on what the goals of antitrust are, but they still try to shoehorn it into a consumer welfare perspective. And at least from what I've seen, tend to say things like, well, it'll benefit consumer welfare in intangible ways, right? Like maybe it won't make it lower prices, but it'll make things better because of more innovation, or it'll make things better because of, you name the, whatever the intangible is, right? It's not measurable by price, but it'll still be better for consumers in some sort of way that we can't quite specify yet.
Yeah, the inevitability question is interesting, and this is partly goes to one's view of how history is formed. Is it sort of, people of distinctive character and personality sort of stamping their mark on history? And certainly you can tell that story. I mean, Chicago had these titans, these big names, people like Dempsey, people like Posner, people like Bork, and Levy, director, Easterbrook, who sort of come in and recast this through the force of their arguments. I do think, though, there was something inevitable about the fall of structuralism. And part of the reason I say that is because at a certain point, even people like Phil Arita, who's writing the Harvard Law professor writing the influential antitrust treatise, basically says, you know what, yeah, I was kind of a little bit wrong about the structuralism stuff on the empirical side. Now, he doesn't become a Chicagoan, right? He and the Arita treatise, and now Herb Hovenkamp sort of as the heir of that, moves towards institutionalism. And this is like all the Steve Breyer stuff about worrying about the sort of the frailties of antitrust process. So it's not that it's not inevitable that the Chicago school path would be chosen. I do think it was inevitable eventually that the particular empirical claims of the structuralists, as framed by them at the time, would be shown to be overstated, right? So I do think that this was, that structuralism had a shelf life. I also think if you look at American history, that we've had epochs of antitrust with sort of very sharp dislocations of the boundary, where an epoch can predominate for a while and then be quickly transplanted by something else. I mean, look at just the New Deal. Within the New Deal, within the space of that one coalition of government, you had sort of three different moments of antitrust, from a kind of associationalism, where we're going to have basically cartelization through the National Industrial Recovery Act. That is a complete loser of an idea. No one likes it after it's tried. And then we kind of move to this period of like super strong Brandeisian enforcement, and Thurman Arnold and Robert Jackson. We're to go after all the big companies. We're going to bring them down. We're going to bring criminal indictments. And then, after Pearl Harbor, suddenly that's no longer palatable, and now we're going to have like big businesses good again, and Arnold is basically fired. That's within the period of one coalition, one administration. And so I do think there's something kind of inevitable about the cycling of ideas about antitrust in American history. We've had many different epochs, and will Chicago end? Yeah, Chicago will end. It's not forever. It's not the end of history. It can't be. It's not. The history of antitrust suggests that whatever happens next, Chicago at some point will see its shelf life ended.
So one of the interesting contrasts that's been going on these days is between the sort of vigorous antitrust enforcement that you see in Europe, which has fined Google a ton of money in recent years for a variety of different practices, whereas in the U.S., you have relatively little enforcement. The FTC looked into Google a few years ago and decided, to sort of close the investigation. But one of the big contrasts between European antitrust, or at least at the EU level, and American antitrust, is that there's no breakup remedy in Europe, right? So the Europeans can sort of act very aggressively and fine companies billions of dollars, but they can't break them into pieces. There's a kind of, and that reflects a sort of fundamental respect for this notion of size and economies of scale and so on, perhaps. Right. I'm not sure exactly what the sort of European origins are for the not having the breakup remedy, but whereas in the US, it seems like whenever you get a sort of resurgence of antitrust, it's played out through this sort of bloodlust, right? It's, we want to break these companies up into pieces, and you have that again. It's, Elizabeth Warren saying, no, I want to break up the tech giants. I don't just want to fine them or regulate them. And does that, could that, I wonder whether that might actually explain the sort of, bipolar nature of antitrust in the U.S., that there's a sort of this tolerance for extremism, and when you have extremism, you get oscillation.
Right. That may be the case. What I found most interesting about Elizabeth Warren's call for breaking up big tech was that her press release begins with what? With a Microsoft case, which is, of course, the poster child for not breaking up. That was a case in which the government wanted to break up. Judge Jackson ordered Microsoft broken up, and then D.C. Circuit en banc unanimously says, no, we're not going to do that. It's a complicated set of reasons, partly due to Judge Jackson's the statements he made to journalists and so forth, and the appearance of impropriety or bias, partly due to the fact that they reverse on some of the liability findings, partly due to the fact that Judge Jackson didn't hold sufficient hearings on it. But you still come away with the idea that the AT&T that was a one-off. And before that, we had Standard Oil. But we've had a lot of discourse around breaking up in American history. We haven't done it very much, and certainly not for a really long time. And so I do think there's a real fear of what would happen to the efficiencies, the economies of scale, if we started ripping companies apart. It's very different to, we've had some cases involving divestitures post-closing in a merger because the merger wasn't scrutinized under Hart-Scott originally, but that's within a year or two typically of catching it. But we haven't had this idea of companies just being broken up because we think they've gotten too big. Apart from cases like Standard Oil and AT&T, really rare that we've seen that in American history. And I think there's a real sense of what might happen if we did that. Partly it's to create a vacuum for someone else to be really big. And that goes back to the idea from the Airlie House conference that there may be economies of scale that drive certain kinds of business organizations, and whatever else we want to do, we are whatever other ideological influence expresses itself in American antitrust. There's always a deeply embedded pragmatism underneath the surface of that, and from right to left, people are really reluctant to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. I mean, a few months ago, I heard Herbert Hovenkamp speak at a conference, and Herb is kind of the heart of American antitrust. He's certainly no Chicago school guy, but he says Herb says something to the effect of the Democrats have to be really worried if their best view of antitrust is let's kill Amazon, because there are millions and millions of Americans from right to left who kind of really love what they get from Amazon, like 2-day shipping, right? And the same thing you can say for Google or Facebook. So I think that as soon as Senator Warren said that, Senator Klobuchar jumps up and says, "Whoa, wait a minute, that's too fast." And I think she has the finger more on the pulse of the center of the American polity, which says, I really don't like bigness. I'm really worried about bigness, but let's not go slaying it just yet. Let's do everything we can to limit its power without killing the goose that lays the golden egg. I think that's a long-standing thing in American history as well.
Yeah, and I was struck the other day by Amazon had been criticized for having this sort of most favored nation requirement that sort of third-party sellers that sell on Amazon can't offer the same product for a lower price on their own website or on any other platform. And there's obvious reasons why that might be anti-competitive. It will harm other platforms that want to sort of compete with Amazon by charging these third-party sellers lower fees, but the sellers can't sort of pass those savings on to consumers, and so it puts them... Okay, so there's competitive issues. But the flip side of it is, it's really great to be able to go on a website and know I don't have to waste any time shopping all over the damn internet to find a lower price, because this is going to be the low price. This is the lowest price on the entire internet, right? And so there's...
I think Americans in particular feel about bigness the way they feel about privacy. They love their privacy, they hate bigness, and yet when you ask them to vote with their pocketbooks or vote with their feet, they show very little actual willingness to buy privacy or security, data security, and they also show, I think, sort of in terms of their buying behavior, a reluctance to avoid the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebook. I mean, they like what they get from scale. So I do think and this is a long-standing thing in American history, that it's not that politically, rhetorically, morally, whatever it is, we have this deep-seated suspicion about concentrated power anywhere. We don't like it, and we want someone to stand up and speak truth to power and speak power back to power. But that said, when it comes to the way we want to buy goods and services or get them for free, as lots of these services have today, every time we'll vote with our pocketbook, with our clicks, to use the services that give us what we want.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder to what extent the sort of reframing of antitrust in terms of consumer welfare and the stickiness of that reframing has complicated or limited the ability kind of politically and functionally to act on the kinds of kind of concerns or opposition to bigness that might have been actionable in the past, and that it seems like people are trying to act on today.
Yeah. I do think that there is often a disconnect between the way that antitrust is framed and what's actually going on in antitrust. Because even during the period of structuralism, you still had the growth of industry. And even when the Supreme Court was striking down all kinds of mergers, you still had very large organizations that were continuing to grow in the American economy, which of course at some point during the structuralist period led to calls for no-fault monopolization. You know, our merger policy isn't strong enough to stop these companies because they're not all growing through mergers. Some of them are just growing because they're getting bigger, and so and the consumer welfare wasn't always just about consumer welfare; it was about economic efficiency. So. You know, there are ways in which the things we say about an antitrust regime are not always the things that are actually happening in terms of the actual practice. I mean, one of the big things, of course, that happens in the 70s that's not Chicago school driven really is the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. And we kind of think about that as this pre-merger notification statute that gives the agencies a chance to look at mergers before they're closed. But that, I mean, I think the Hart-Scott Act, almost more than all the Chicago school, had a bigger effect at institutionalizing economic analysis, because what it did is it shifted merger review from the courts to the agencies. Yeah. And it created sort of the professionalization of antitrust, technical antitrust in the agencies. And the merger guidelines become a much more important source of prediction about merger outcomes than case law does. And institutionally, it's bureaucratic, it's expert, it's within the agencies this stuff is being done. That was not what Hart-Scott was supposed to accomplish. That was not the intention of Congress in 1976. That's very much the outcome of that. And so when we think about the stories about what happens, whether it's Airlie House or anything else, there are multiple different things that are happening simultaneously on the problem. Some of which are intentional. You know, scholarship by Chicago school people, that's intentional. But also things like Hart-Scott, which have a huge effect that's not solely intentional.
And to add to that, Donald Baker a few years ago made the point that the other effect of Hart-Scott-Rodino was to make merger review a lot less high profile, because before these mergers would happen and the agencies would get on them after they were consummated, and that's big news, right? I mean, you know, if you know, two large firms merge and the agencies go to break them back up again, I mean, that's breakup happening. That's going to be that makes antitrust seem a lot more important. Whereas if you're just sort of nipping them in the bud before these deals actually get consummated, it becomes a lot less sort of politically charged. And I think that also contributed to the reduction in that sort of the feeling that there was an antitrust cop on the beat. Oddly enough.
Richard Hofstadter wrote his famous essay, What Happened to the Antitrust Movement in the Early 1960s. And already by that point, he's talking about sort of antitrust as having, the movement as having ended. And we've kind of gone to a period when antitrust is, you know, he kind of makes the point that we used to have lots of antitrust rhetoric without much antitrust. But then today we have quite a bit of actual antitrust, but not that much rhetoric about it. It's kind of gone underground. And this is before Chicago, this is before Hart-Scott. And so I think that really accelerated the 70s where we still had quite a bit of antitrust, but it just wasn't salient, it wasn't observed by most people. You know, you often hear the Chicago killed antitrust. In fact, you know, Richard Posner made this quip, you know, last year, the year before, that, well, antitrust is dead, isn't it? But if you look by many different measures, antitrust has been quite active and alive. Private enforcement has remained very active since it fell off in the 70s. You get a lot. I mean, you get a lot of merger review happening. If you go to the American Bar Association spring meeting and just see the amount of money represented in the room in terms of the thousands of people who make their living off the antitrust industry, you know, globally now, you start realizing there's still a lot of activity that's happening here. Now, whether it's effective or not is another issue, but it's not dead. But it is much less salient. It's much less out of the public eye.
No, you know, right at that antitrust spring meeting, which brings together something like 7,000-10,000 antitrust lawyers and academics from around the world. I remember a few years ago I was there and there was a panel, and it was mergers from you know, how to get your merger from 3 firms in the industry to 2 firms in an industry passed, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there is, I think, you know, right, there's a huge antitrust industry, but whether it's effective, I think is, you know, that's a real question. But the flip side is, should it? I mean, do we want it to be effective, right? I mean, is more competition always a good thing?
Well, so some area, so we talk about antitrust as though it's one thing, and you have to break it down into different things. I think we're at a period of time when anti-cartel enforcement is at its as strong as it's ever been. I mean, you look at the corporate fines, you look at imprisonment, look at just the resources we have through leniency, through global cooperation agreements, through amnesty deals. I mean, it's not that it's perfect, but I think, and this is bipartisan, administration to administration, we go after cartels, and the agencies take that seriously. So that's a huge piece when we talk about antitrust, that people just kind of forget about the conversation. It's like it doesn't happen, but that's a very important aspect of antitrust. Merger enforcement, I mean, so could it be stronger? Of course it could be stronger. Should it be stronger? That's the question on the table. But it's not like we don't have merger enforcement today. I mean, every year there are deals that are killed. What you do, to the earlier point, you see very few litigations, and that's because most questionable deals either aren't proposed because people know they can't happen, or they're proposed and some of them are just dropped because the agencies say no, and some of them are negotiated, so we have either conduct remedies or structural remedies. So there's still a lot of activity around mergers. You propose a 4-3 today, good luck. I mean, that's not by any means assured. Talk to AT&T, T-Mobile about that, right? So again, have we let through mergers, too many mergers in beer, too many mergers in airlines, too many mergers in oil, too many mergers in banks? Like maybe, but that's a different proposition than there not being a real, a serious antitrust regime in place in the United States today, which there is. I think the one place where we can talk about whether there's, there really is that much activity, certainly at the public level, is monopolization enforcement, which neither agency has had any appetite to enforce vigorously for really since the Clinton administration. But they're querying whether we need public enforcement because there's an awful lot of private enforcement as well. You look at the volume of cases, including successful cases that are brought under monopolization theories every year, and there's there's certainly activity happening there as well.
Yeah, you point to really I think important and weird inconsistency in the Chicago school critique and what happened afterwards, which is that Chicago in Airlie House was all about, there were this, right before Airlie House there were all these proposals for no-fault monopolization statutes and going out and breaking up big firms even if they aren't doing wrong just because they're big. And then you get, so you get all the Chicago school people saying, well, big is good. And yet almost all the arguments they make about the virtues of large size firms could apply to the virtues of cartels, right? I mean, there's no reason why cartels can't work together to innovate. There's no, right? I mean, there's just, there's really sort of this weird over-determinacy of sort of the arguments that Chicago makes. And yet, if there was one thing that's happened after Chicago, in which Chicago held sacred, it was the notion that we should go after cartels and we should ramp that up.
I think the Chicago answer is that cartels don't give you any efficiencies for all the losses of competition. So a true cartel, unlike, say, a research joint venture, in 84, we passed a statute that's designed to protect research joint ventures, and that is part of the Chicago project, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But the idea of a naked cartel, I think even Chicago got that if all you're doing is getting in a smoke-filled room together to reduce output and increase prices, there's no efficiency associated with that, or almost none. Like I think some Chicago people could figure out possible efficiencies. I think for Chicago, the big question was, is that conduct pernicious in the sense that cartels are long-lasting? And lots of the Chicago school critique was, no, cartels, there are these inherent temptations to cheat, intrigue can happen when prices go up, and these things fall apart under their own weight. So, but I think by and large, the Reagan administration brought cases against cartels, lots in public procurement. And that makes sense, of course, because who's paying for public procurement? The taxpayer, right? Reagan wants to reduce the tax burden on Americans, and so part of this is kind of going after cartels and people supplying the taxpayer at the taxpayer's instance. But I certainly from Clinton to Bush to Obama, you see a real sort of, I think, consensus, bipartisan consensus that cartels are something we can all agree that need to be heavily prosecuted, and I think quite effectively overall.
So I think we're reaching the end of our time. So thanks very much for being with us here. It's been wonderful getting the chance to talk about not just whether or not antitrust died in 1974, but the present and of antitrust as well. So thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.